All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today, the war in Ukraine. And look, I know you've all sent in tons of material, and you're really trying to get past just the headlines. You want to understand the history, the global forces at play here, like what really led to this whole thing.
Yeah, it's a complex situation for sure.
It is, and to help us unpack all of it, we're turning to, well, a pretty controversial perspective from an expert who's been right in the thick of things. We're talking about Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
And you're right, to call him just an academic would be a huge understatement. We're talking about someone who's advised governments, presidents, even international organizations for over 30 years.
Wow.
And in this speech he gave at the EU Parliament, he lays out a very specific and, let's be honest, a controversial view of how we got here.
So before we get too deep into it, can you give us the quick version? Like, what's the big takeaway from Professor Sachs?
Well, I mean, the shortest version is Sachs argues that the U.S. has been pursuing this strategy of global dominance since the end of the Cold War. He calls it unipolarity, basically the U.S. being the only superpower and calling all the shots.
Okay.
And he believes that this strategy, specifically expanding NATO, is a big reason why we have the conflict in Ukraine today.
So he's putting some of the responsibility for the war on the U.S.
That's exactly it. And to understand why he thinks that, we need to rewind a bit.
Okay.
Sachs starts by laying out his own history in Eastern Europe. He was there working with Gorbachev and Yeltsin back in Russia, advised the Polish government in the late 80s, even helped bring in the Estonian currency. He's seen these geopolitical shifts up close.
So this isn't just some theory for him. He's been there.
Exactly. And that experience leads him to believe the U.S. made promises to Russia, especially about not expanding NATO, then broke those promises. He brings up this book, The Grand Chessboard, by Zbigniew Brzezinski from '97, which he sees as proof of a deliberate plan to contain Russia.
The Grand Chessboard, yeah, that title sounds a little ominous. Is he saying the U.S. was playing some big geopolitical chess game with Russia as the opponent?
That's what he's arguing, and it goes beyond just NATO. Sachs lays out a whole timeline. The bombing of Belgrade in '99, interventions in Sudan and Somalia, the Iraq War.
Wait, is he saying all of those were part of this big plan for world domination?
That's how he presents it. He even goes so far as to say the Iraq War was done for Israel's benefit, driven by people in the Pentagon aligned with Netanyahu.
Okay, that's a bold claim, even for someone like Sachs. But where does Ukraine fit into all this? When does he see things really going south?
He points to the 2014 Maidan Revolution as a turning point. That was when the pro-Russian president Yanukovych was ousted. Sachs believes the U.S. was very involved in that regime change.
He even brings up that leaked phone call, right? With Victoria Nuland, who was Assistant Secretary of State, talking to the U.S. ambassador, the one where she said, well,
Exactly. That call, for Sachs, proves the U.S. was shaping events in Ukraine for their own gain. And he says even after Maidan, there were chances for peace, like the Minsk agreements, which were supposed to give autonomy to those Russian-speaking areas in eastern Ukraine.
right.
But Sachs claims the U.S. undermined those agreements, stopping a peaceful solution.
So he's saying the U.S. pushed for conflict, not peace.
Yeah, and this brings us to the current war. Sachs says Putin's goal at first wasn't to conquer all of Ukraine, but to force negotiations. Negotiations about Ukraine staying neutral, not joining any military alliance.
So what happened? Why didn't they negotiate?
Sachs says they almost had a deal early on, thanks to Turkey. But Ukraine walked away because the U.S. and UK pressured them to keep fighting. He sees that as a huge missed opportunity.
So he's saying the U.S. pushed Ukraine to keep fighting instead of finding a peaceful solution. But doesn't he admit that Russia was the one who actually invaded?
He does, but he also says the U.S. is responsible for creating the situation that led to that invasion. And there's one more thing he focuses on, which he thinks is crucial: nuclear weapons.
Okay.
Specifically, the U.S. pulling out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty back in 2002.
The ABM treaty. Can you explain that for those of us who aren't nuclear experts? What does that have to do with Ukraine?
The ABM Treaty was this agreement between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It stopped them from building systems that could shoot down each other's nuclear missiles.
So both sides stayed vulnerable, so no one would risk starting a nuclear war.
Exactly. It was this scary balance of terror, but it worked for a long time. But when the U.S. left the treaty, Sachs says it threw off that balance and made Russia feel a lot more vulnerable.
So leaving that treaty made Russia nervous, maybe even paranoid, and that led to things getting worse.
Right. And he also brings up the U.S. putting missile systems in Poland and Romania, which made Russia feel even more threatened. And he says the U.S. refusing to rule out putting those systems in Ukraine was a huge red line for Putin.
So he's building this case that the U.S. had a big role in creating the situation that led to this war.
Yeah,
But this is just one part of a really complicated story.
it is, and we'll get to that in a bit.
Okay, because you mentioned there were some tense moments during Sachs's speech at the EU Parliament.
Oh, there were, and the questions they asked him really get to the heart of what he thinks Europe should do next.
I'm already interested. Let's get to those questions.
So we've laid out Sachs's argument. The U.S. and unipolarity, those broken promises about NATO, all the things he says led up to the war.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to process, and I bet that audience in the EU Parliament had some thoughts.
Oh, they did. It was tense, I have to say. And the questions they asked Sachs were really revealing, like what now? What should Europe do going forward?
Right.
And one of the first came from a Czech member of parliament.
Okay, and that's significant because the Czech Republic joined NATO after the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Like a lot of those Central and Eastern European countries.
Exactly. And this MP, he was frustrated, even angry. He felt like countries like his had been used, manipulated, he even said macked, which I guess, rough translation, kind of like tricked or taken advantage of. He wanted to know what they should do now, knowing all this history.
So basically, he's saying, if what Sachs is saying is true, what are we supposed to do?
Right. And Sachs, whose wife and grandchildren are actually Czech, he really emphasized that Europe needs its own foreign policy, one that's based on what he called realism, meaning understanding both sides, negotiating honestly.
That sounds reasonable, but didn't Sachs's whole point hinge on the U.S. preventing real negotiations? How can Europe negotiate if one side isn't being honest?
That's a good point. But Sachs thinks Europe could be a force for peace, even if the U.S. doesn't play along. He also had some pretty direct advice for the Baltic states, like Estonia. They share a border with Russia, and they have a lot of Russian speakers, too.
What did he say to them?
Basically, he said stop with what he called the Russophobia, stop provoking Russia. Specifically, he said it's not smart for Estonia to be talking about breaking up Russia when they've got such a powerful neighbor.
Yeah, I can see how that would make Russia nervous, considering their history.
Exactly. And he even brought up those countries that outlawed the Russian language. He said it's wrong to deny people their language and culture. He really wanted them to, act like adults, focus on respect and understanding.
So even if you agree with Sachs on the past, this is a pretty radical shift he wants, right, in how Europe deals with Russia.
It is. He wants a total reset to move past all that hostility and suspicion that's been there for so long. And another question, this time from a reporter at the Brussels Times, brought up something else that was really controversial. Trump's demands for NATO members to spend more on defense.
Oh yeah, that 2% target. Trump wanted everyone in NATO to spend at least 2% of their GDP on the military. How does that connect to Sachs's argument?
Well, Sachs sees that as more proof that the U.S. is looking out for itself, not for Europe's security. And his answer was kind of surprising. He said NATO headquarters should be moving out of Brussels.
Wow, that's a big statement. He's basically saying NATO isn't good for Europe anymore.
Right. He thinks Europe needs its own security system, separate from NATO. And he really goes after Trump here, calls him an arms salesman, basically saying this push for more spending would mostly help U.S. weapons companies, not Europe itself.
So instead of giving money to the U.S. military industry, what does Sachs think Europe should do?
He says they should invest in their own technology, their own defense, become what he calls strategically autonomous, basically able to act on their own on the world stage. And then he goes on about all the things he thinks Europe stands for that the U.S. doesn't, like climate action, social democracy, working together with other countries, following the UN Charter.
He's painting a pretty different picture of those two, isn't he? Europe as this champion of good things and the U.S., well, not so much.
Yeah, exactly. And he contrasts it with what he calls this deep Anglo-Saxon libertarianism that he thinks has driven U.S. policy for the past 200 years. He even claimed the Biden administration wasn't allowed to use the phrase sustainable development goals, which, if true, that's kind of telling.
So he's saying Europe and the U.S. have totally different values, different ideas of what the world should be. But how does this European path actually work? What would a truly independent Europe even look like?
Well, a Slovakian MP asked Sachs that directly. He wanted to know what message Sachs would send to Russia right now. And this is where it gets interesting, because this MP mentioned that he had been talking to Russian leaders, even though his own prime minister almost got assassinated for having views similar to Professor Sachs.
Wow, so this guy's taking a real risk trying to understand the other side.
He is, and Sachs, he emphasized that Europe and Russia need to talk directly, sit down with Putin, work out security guarantees for everyone, including the Baltic states. He even said specifically to talk to Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who Sachs thinks is brilliant.
So he's saying talk to Putin, even though many people see him as a war criminal.
Yeah. And he criticizes Europe for being too dependent on the U.S., begging to be included in U.S.-led negotiations. He says Europe should be leading, not following.
So this is a power shift he wants, not just between Europe and Russia, but between Europe and the U.S. as well.
Exactly. And he says it should be based on talking, diplomacy, and mutual respect. He wants European leaders to stop all the yelling, all the warmongering, and actually have a real conversation with Russia.
That's a powerful message, and it seems like something he keeps coming back to, the need to talk, to listen, to understand different points of view, even if you disagree with them.
Right, and that comes up again when a member of the AfD, that's the Alternative for Germany party, challenged Sachs on the whole NATO expansion thing. This MP was saying, look, countries like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, they chose to join NATO. It was their right as sovereign nations.
So he's pushing back on the idea that NATO expansion was this U.S. plot to make Russia mad, like Sachs claims.
Exactly. And Sachs says, okay, sure, those countries wanted to join, but the U.S. should have said no. He pointed out that a bunch of people back then, like former Defense Secretary William Perry and George Kennan, they warned against expanding NATO, said it could lead to a new Cold War.
So even if those countries wanted in, he's saying the U.S. should have thought about the bigger picture, the long-term stability of Europe.
Right. And he said Ukraine and Georgia were especially sensitive because they're right next to Russia. Plus, all of this is happening while the U.S. is already messing with nuclear arms control, like with the ABM treaty.
He really keeps coming back to that ABM treaty.
It's key to his argument. And he even compared it to the Cuban Missile Crisis, saying the U.S. freaking out about Soviet missiles in Cuba is kind of like how Russia felt about NATO expanding right up to their border.
Okay, now I see how he's connecting those things. If the U.S. had been more careful, left some neutral space between NATO and Russia, maybe things wouldn't have gotten so bad.
That's his point. And he wants Europe to break free from this pattern of the U.S. doing things that lead to conflict and instability. He wants them to make their own choices based on diplomacy, cooperation, and a real commitment to peace.
We've covered a lot of ground. Sachs definitely gave a different view of the war and the role of the U.S. and Europe in the world.
He did. And it's a view that makes you rethink things, makes you question what you hear.
It makes you think about the future of Europe and how they relate to the U.S. Sachs seems to think Europe could be a force for peace in the world, but only if they stand on their own 2 feet and fight for their own interests.
He does, and he wants Europe to seize that opportunity, really take charge of what happens in global politics.
Okay, so we've explored a lot, but there's still some questions from the audience that we need to get to. One in particular really jumped out at me, this idea of Finlandization as a way out of this mess.
That's a really interesting concept, and one that Sachs has strong feelings about. We'll dive into that next.
Okay, so we've been going through Professor Sachs' perspective on the war in Ukraine, and it's definitely not the usual take you hear. But what about going forward? Like, what does he think should happen now? You mentioned something about Finlandization and a question from the audience. What is that exactly, and how does it fit in here?
Right, so Finlandization, it's basically what Finland did during the Cold War. They stayed neutral, managed to have good relations with both the Soviets and the West, kind of avoided getting caught in the middle of everything.
So they were like walking on eggshells, trying not to make anyone mad. But why bring that up now? Is someone saying Ukraine should do that?
Well, an MEP from Luxembourg actually asked Sachs that directly. He wanted to know if Sachs thought Finlandization could work for Ukraine as a way to de-escalate, find some kind of peace.
And what did he say? Does he think it's a good idea?
He does. He even pointed out that Finland, during the Cold War, they were consistently ranked one of the happiest countries. He said their neutrality let them focus on their own stuff, their economy, their society, without getting pulled into these dangerous fights.
So staying neutral can be a good thing, not a bad thing.
That's what he's arguing. He even mentioned Austria, another neutral country that's done pretty well for itself. He thinks if the U.S. had really wanted peace in Europe, they would have encouraged countries like Ukraine, Sweden, Finland to stay neutral, like a buffer zone between NATO and Russia.
Instead, he's saying they pushed for NATO to expand, and look where that got us.
Exactly. And he seems to think a neutral Ukraine, with guarantees from both Russia and the West that they'll be safe, could be a real way to end this war.
It's interesting because all this talk about Finlandization, it goes back to what Sachs keeps saying about Europe needing to decide for themselves what they want when it comes to security and foreign policy, not just following what the U.S. wants.
Absolutely. He brings that up over and over, especially at the end of his speech when he's talking directly to the EU Parliament.
What does he say to them? Any advice on how to make this happen, this independent, peaceful future?
He tells them straight up, you guys got to lead the way in making peace in Europe. Reminds them, they represent the people, and people want peace. He says, work together, even if you're from different parties. Find a way to make peace that's led by Europe, not someone else. He even offered to help organize, monthly discussions on this stuff.
So he's not just complaining, he's trying to actually do something.
Yeah. And he ends on a kind of hopeful note. Says, in the long run, things can be good for Europe and the world, but only if we construct the peace. It's something we have to build.
Well, I think it's fair to say Professor Sachs gave us a lot to think about. It's a different way of looking at the war, that's for sure. But it does make you question some of the assumptions we often make about how the world works.
Yeah, he wants us to see things from a different angle, to really think about the information we're getting. And whether you agree with him or not, it highlights how important it is to get different viewpoints, not just listen to the same old story.
And in the end, I think his message is about empowerment, about Europe taking charge of its own future and being a force for peace.
He truly believes peace doesn't just happen, it's something you have to work for. And he's urging Europe to take on that responsibility.
It's a powerful message and one I think we all need to hear no matter what we think about this war. So what are your thoughts? Does Sachs's analysis change how you see things? What do you think the future holds for Europe and for peace in the world? Let us know. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep with us. See you next time on The Deep Dive.